This is a t-shirt. It costs $5. Let me walk you through what went into making it. The cotton was grown in India, in Punjab. Water is pumped from aquifers that are dropping 3 feet every year. Pesticides are sprayed onto the fields, pesticides that run off into groundwater. That cotton gets shipped to Bangladesh, where it's ginned, spun into yarn, and woven into fabric. Then the fabric is sent to Pakistan for dyeing. There, industrial wastewater containing heavy metals and chemical dyes runs through open drains and into rivers like the Ravi. Then it's shipped back to Bangladesh for sewing. Someone sits at a machine for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, earning about $113 a month. The finished shirts are loaded into containers and shipped across the Pacific to Los Angeles, burning bunker fuel all the way. They're trucked from the port to a warehouse, from there to a distribution center, and from there to your local store. All of that for $5. How's that possible? Think about the labor, the materials, the energy, the coordination across 3 countries and 2 oceans. All of that for $5. The math doesn't work unless someone else is paying. Someone else is paying. The farmer in Punjab whose fields are getting harder to irrigate every year because the water table keeps dropping. The family in Faisalabad drinking from a river that carries untreated textile wastewater, heavy metals, chemical dyes and acids. The seamstress in Dhaka working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, earning $113 a month. These are real costs. They didn't disappear. They were just removed from the price tag and handed to someone who wasn't at the checkout. This process has a name: externalization. Externalization is when the costs of producing something are pushed onto someone else, onto workers, onto communities, onto ecosystems, onto people somewhere else, or somewhen else. That shirt didn't cost $5. The water was depleted, the soil was damaged, the river was poisoned, the worker was underpaid, and carbon was emitted, a lot of carbon. All of that has a cost, a real cost. Someone's paying it right now, or will pay it in the future. And the first question we need to answer isn't whether we know this is happening. We do. The question is, how did we build an entire economic system that requires it? To understand that, we need to go back to when this pattern was first set. We go back to Manchester, England in 1780, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. A mill owner faces a decision. Water power has limits. Mills must be built by rivers. Production is constrained by flow and season. But now, steam power can change everything. Install a coal-fired engine, and you can spin cotton all year round, day and night, create hundreds of jobs, increase production tenfold, lower the price of cloth. The city transforms. And the cost? Black smoke settling over narrow streets, rivers turning dark with waste, coughing in the tenements downwind. But here's what makes externalization possible. Those costs are dispersed across tens of thousands of people. They're delayed, showing up as illness years later, and they're impossible to attribute. When old Jack the Weaver died at 43, there was no germ theory, no epidemiology. Was it the smoke, or was it the damp? Perhaps it was God's will. No one could trace his death to any single chimney. At that scale, in that world, with no framework to connect dispersed harms back to specific sources, the calculation worked. The benefits were immediate, visible, and concentrated. A level of surplus and wealth unprecedented in human history. The costs were distant, diluted, and unattributable. This wasn't villainy, this was progress. The question isn't whether this decision was rational, it's whether it was rare. Well, it wasn't rare. Manchester became the model. Steam power spread to Birmingham, Glasgow, to Lille, the Ruhr Valley. Within 50 years, coal-fired industry had transformed Europe. And for the next century, externalization had an even simpler mechanism. Colonial extraction. Cotton from India, rubber from the Congo, minerals from South Africa, sugar from the Caribbean. The pattern was always the same. Concentrated gains in London, Paris and Brussels. Dispersed costs in Calcutta, Kinshasa and Cape Town. With one difference. The diffusion wasn't accidental, it was enforced. When the mill owner in Manchester bought cheap cotton, someone in Gujarat paid the cost. But the connection was invisible to him by distance, by market, and by the complexity of global trade. Under colonialism, the connection was explicit and maintained at gunpoint. This wasn't a deviation from the pattern of externalization, it was the pattern made clear. The pattern was always the same: enormous concentrated gains and dispersed, delayed and unattributable costs. And it didn't stop at industrialization. Every surge of modern prosperity followed the same logic. The post-war boom, cheap oil, suburban sprawl and disposable everything. The cost? Carbon accumulating in the atmosphere. But in 1955, who was measuring parts per million? China's Industrial Revolution, lifting 800 million people out of poverty in 4 decades. The cost? 70% of China's rivers polluted, 90% of urban groundwater contaminated. But when you're lifting millions out of poverty, that's tomorrow's problem. Externalities aren't rare market failures. They're pervasive and systemic. Joseph Stiglitz won the Nobel Prize saying this. William Nordhaus won his for calculating the social cost of carbon, the real price of burning fossil fuels once damage is counted. Nicholas Stern called climate change the greatest market failure the world has ever seen. But Herman Daly made the distinction that matters most. We built our economy on an empty world. Small populations, vast resources, enormous capacity to absorb waste. That economy worked for a while. But we don't live in an empty world anymore. And that changes everything. The economy kept growing, but the planet didn't. For a long time, growth stayed smaller than the systems containing it. There was room to absorb damage, time to dilute consequences. Smoke dispersed into vast atmospheres. Waste dissolved into enormous oceans. Forests regrew. Rivers cleaned themselves. The calculation that worked in Manchester kept working in Mumbai, Sao Paulo and Shenzhen. But eventually, the economy grew into its container. When that happens, externalized costs don't disappear, they accumulate. Carbon absorbs slowly, but we admit it faster than nature can remove it. Aquifers drop faster than they refill. Ecosystems lose resilience with each chemical load. The feedback loops tighten. This is what delayed feedback looks like. The costs we externalized for 2 centuries are arriving, not all at once, but faster than we can adapt. What does that look like on the ground? Well, not apocalypse, aggregation. Heat records broken summer after summer. Floods that used to be once in a century events, now happening twice a decade. Droughts lasting longer and hitting harder. Wildfires burning larger and fiercer. Fire seasons weeks longer than they were decades ago. Hurricanes stalling over cities, dumping a month of rain in 3 days. Insurance companies pulling out of entire regions because the math no longer works. But it's not just climate. Inequality is widening because externalized costs fall heaviest on those with the least. Public infrastructure is crumbling. Roads, bridges, water systems built when externalization still had room to run. Healthcare systems are strained. Respiratory illnesses, heat stress, vector-borne diseases moving into new territories. Political systems are fracturing under the weight of problems that seem unsolvable within existing frameworks. These aren't separate crises. They're all part of the same bill. Costs we didn't pay in 1850, in 1950, and in 2000, they are arriving now, not as one catastrophic failure, but as 1,000 tightening constraints. We've seen this coming for decades. Scientists have been warning us. The data has been clear. The projections have been accurate. So the question isn't how bad will it get? The question is, if we saw this coming, why are we still stuck? Because we've been measuring the wrong thing from the very start. Let's go back to Manchester 1780. What did success look like? More cloth produced, more wealth accumulated, more jobs created, surplus growing. Nobody was measuring, are people healthier, are communities stronger, can children breathe? We had no science of human flourishing, no framework for measuring what actually matters. Just production, growth, and accumulation. That mill owner optimizing for output wasn't ignoring well-being. He had no way to measure it. And then, in 1934, we made it official. Simon Kuznets invented GDP. It was brilliant for what it was meant to do, track economic activity during the Depression. But Kuznets warned Congress, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. Robert Kennedy said it even more clearly in 1968. Gross national product measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. We formalized a measurement system that counts extraction as income and degradation as growth. GDP counts the cost of pollution cleanup, but not the value of clean air. It counts the logging of forests, but not their existence as an asset. It counts the sale of a $5 t-shirt, but not the depleted aquifer or the poisoned river. Once GDP became the scorecard, we locked in the mistake we'd been making for 2 centuries. Count the gains, ignore the costs. What we didn't measure, we couldn't protect. Health, ecosystems, social cohesion, and future stability. You cannot manage what you don't measure. And we've been navigating with a dashboard that only shows production, while the gauges for water, soil, atmosphere, and social trust drop toward empty. So, what do? Once you can see the real costs, a solution appears. Internalization. It's simpler than it sounds. Internalization means costs stay with the activity that creates them, not pushed onto nature, not onto distant workers, and not onto the future. If producing a t-shirt depletes an aquifer, the price reflects the full cost of water and its replenishment, not just the cost of pumping it out. If dyeing fabric poisons a river, the price includes water treatment. If burning coal damages lungs and the atmosphere, the price accounts for the harm. When prices tell the truth, our decisions can change. Cheaper methods that actually cost more get expensive. Expensive methods that preserve systems become competitive. Innovation shifts from how do we make this cheaper to how do we make this sustainable. Will things cost more at checkout? Yes, but we were always paying these costs. The difference is who pays and when. Right now, the costs are paid in healthcare bills when workers breathe polluted air, in lost livelihoods when aquifers run dry and farms fail, in disaster relief when floods destroy infrastructure, in climate adaptation, seawalls, cooling centres, crop insurance, and in migration, conflict and instability when resources collapse. So yes, we're already paying these costs. We just don't see them connected to the $5 t-shirt that caused them. The question isn't whether we pay, it's whether the costs show up where decisions get made at the point of production, not decades later in someone else's emergency. Internalization is about honesty and accounting, making the invisible visible. So, why hasn't this happened? Because we're all trapped in the system we depend on to survive. We know what the $5 t-shirt costs. We buy it anyway, not because we're immoral, but because we don't have a real alternative. The honest price would be $25, $30. But as long as the $5 version exists, that's what we buy, because if we don't, someone else will. And the $30 version, made with fair wages, clean water, and honest costs, can't compete. It doesn't exist at scale. The system doesn't allow it. This is a prisoner's dilemma, playing out across 8 billion people. Half of India's agriculture runs on aquifers in Punjab that are dropping 3 feet per year. If you stop pumping, people starve. Price it honestly, people still can't afford it. American suburbs can't function without cheap gasoline. European industry can't compete with honest carbon prices unless everyone does it simultaneously. The seamstress in Dhaka needs that $113 a month. The farmer in Punjab needs to sell cotton. You need to eat food you can afford. We're all making locally rational choices in a globally catastrophic system. Industries resist honest pricing, yes, but they're just responding to the same trap at scale. Politicians fear honest prices because voters fear them, because we actually would face higher costs at checkout, and we don't have spare money, and we wouldn't trust the distribution of costs to be fair. And then there's the global justice problem. The countries that industrialised first, in Europe and in North America, got rich by externalising costs for 2 centuries. Coal-fired industry, colonial extraction, cheap oil. They built their wealth on a playbook that worked: externalise the cost, capture the gains. Now the same countries are telling developing nations, you can't do what we did. You can't burn coal. You can't ignore pollution. You can't externalise. China looks at 800 million people lifted from poverty and says, we used the only playbook that's ever worked at scale. India looks at its development needs and says, you got yours by externalising, now we're supposed to stay poor. And they're not wrong. Any solution that ignores this doesn't just fail morally, it fails practically. You cannot ask countries to choose between survival and honesty. You cannot tell people to stay poor for a climate they didn't break. When dependency runs that deep, personal, political, and global, just internalise the costs sounds like just stop eating. So the real difficulty isn't that we don't know what to do, it's that we can't imagine unwinding systems we depend on to survive without killing ourselves in the transition. The hardest part? Imagining a fair distribution of costs when the benefits were distributed so unfairly for so long. But that's exactly what the solution requires. Not because it's morally right, though it is, because it's the only version that might actually work. You cannot build a stable system on compounding injustice. Eventually it fractures, which means the question isn't whether we internalise costs. It's whether we can design a transition that's both survivable and fair. So where does that leave us? We're an unlucky generation. Not because we caused this, we didn't invent externalization. We didn't design the system. We didn't choose to be born into an economy built on deferred costs. We're unlucky because we happen to be alive when the bill arrives. And because we're the first generation that has to figure out how to pay it. The mill owner in Manchester made a rational choice. The post-war planners built suburbs on cheap oil with the information they had. China lifted 800 million people out of poverty using the only playbook that ever worked at scale. By the time they industrialised, climate science was settled. They knew, but they also knew that no country had ever lifted so many people out of poverty that quickly using any other method. And they still had room to run, atmospheric space, ecosystem capacity, that the first industrialisers had already used up in their area. The choice wasn't between knowing and not knowing. It was between using a system that worked or inventing one that had never existed. We can see what 2 centuries of externalization produces. We can measure what they couldn't. We know what they didn't, which means we don't get to avoid the costs, but we might be able to distribute them fairly. And we're already paying them in disasters, in displacement, in systems breaking down. The only question left is whether we pay chaotically in emergencies, letting them fall wherever they land, or whether we pay deliberately with accounting that's honest and distribution that's fair. We don't get to choose whether this is expensive. It already is. We only get to choose whether we pay attention while we pay. That's not doom and it's not hope, it's just recognition. This is the hand we're dealt. We can't fold, we can only play it. Alone and chaotically, each nation, each community, each person scrambling to capture what they can while the system deteriorates around us, or together, with coordination, honest accounting about costs, and fair distribution of who pays them. The second option isn't easy. It might not even be likely, but it's the only one where we don't just pay the costs, we actually solve the problem. And it starts with seeing it clearly.